Hello, I'm Merv. Veronica looked on the internet to see if there's anything useful to help you people in your important work, community health. She come across me and we got talking, and she seemed to think that there are a few things that I had to offer that might be useful. Now with COVID, I'm not sure whether I'll get up there, so I thought maybe I'll make a video, and if I don't get up there, you can watch the video and then we'll have a Zoom session to discuss it a bit further. I want to go through some laws, if you like, that apply to emotional health, that gives us a solid framework in which to operate. I also plan to use the movie Samson and Delilah. I hope you've seen it because it gives some good examples of what I'm talking about. So I guess the first law is that every living thing interacts with its environment to get its needs met. Doesn't matter what gender, what culture, rich or poor, there are no exceptions. It is a law that applies to every living thing. On your way into Katherine, you might have seen the bullocky down by the creek. You might have seen a long-necked turtle and barramundi and crocodile that live in the billabong. You know the cheeky camp dogs that run around and chase the birds. And of course trees and pandanus palms and grass. Every living thing interacts with its environment to get its needs met. Now, of course, there are differences. Trees have to cop it sweet. If there's a drought, they might die. They can't get up and move and go live somewhere else. But humans, of course, they have a brain and they have an awareness of their environment that trees don't have, and it gives them a lot more choices. And they interact with their environment. Basically, there are three general environments. The first one is a physical environment. That might be where you live, might be country, might be Darwin or Casuarina. That's a physical environment that you operate within. Then there's also a social environment where there's interaction with the mob, family, community, people from other communities. That's a social environment. And there's also a third one, which is a virtual environment, where via the internet and other telecommunications, we're able to communicate and interact with humans even though they are not there. So how do we make sense of our environment? It's a process called pattern matching. And it simply means that through the five senses, what we hear, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, and what we touch, they're sense organs, and they interact with their environment. They get the messages, and from that they send it to a processing part in the brain, and it matches. If I see a Toyota coming along the road, well, I may never have seen that Toyota before, but I know what Toyota type things look like, and that is a Toyota type thing, and it matches with a pattern in my brain that says Toyota, and I understand what it is. I don't get gosh wobble thinking what on earth that is. Now that has happened. If we don't have a pattern in our brain, it will not make sense to us. Years ago, the British government wanted to try out some new bombs. And of course there's nowhere in England where you can bomb anything because there's people everywhere. So they come to Australia in the desert out in north of South Australia. And of course to check that there weren't any people there before they let off these bombs, they had to send crews out there and make sure there weren't any desert people there, and to shift them if they were. Well, they come across a tribe of indigenous people and that this was their first contact with white people. And the ABC did a documentary on it a few years ago, and they interviewed this old lady, and she was just a teenager at the time, and she was a little way away from the camp, and she looked up and she saw something, no pattern, didn't know what to call it, didn't have anything that helped her make sense of that. So she ran back to the camp and she said, quick, quick, there's a white rock rolling towards the camp. Now it was rock-like in that it had shape, and it was moving like a rolling stone moves. So that's the best way she could describe what she had seen to the rest of the people in the camp. So that gives us some idea of this process called pattern matching. And where it's useful is to understand that some people simply do not have a pattern in order to make sense of that situation. And the pattern that they do use to make sense of that very often is not the right one. For example, I've worked with young people that lived on the streets and they were pretty wild, and they were not able to make that fine assessment of situations, especially social situations, and they relied on just a couple of patterns that centered around aggression. Even in talking to them, if you challenge them a little bit, you can see them starting to get an aggressive stance. That was the only way they made sense of things, is to hit it, or in their terms they'd say bash the shit out of it. That's how they reacted, because they had such a limited way of making sense. And very often they reacted that way to people like myself that was trying to help them. So understanding pattern matching and how you can increase that library of patterns is very, very useful. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, generally speaking, girls have a better array of patterns in order to make sense of things than boys do. Adolescence for girls, they mature earlier. There's obvious reasons for that. But boys tend to be later in their development. So very often, adolescent males, even up into early 20s, are still developing a way of making sense of the world. And that needs to be considered. If we use the example of Samson and Delilah, you're probably familiar with the scene. Samson sitting on the fence. His way of viewing his environment is it's fairly bleak, there's nothing to do, and he's bored. So he's sitting on the fence, and that's how he's making sense of his environment. Now, curiously enough, Delilah is inhabiting exactly the same environment, and yet she has a wider array of patterns in order to make sense of what she's doing and what that environment can offer as she interacts with it. She's sitting down with her grandmother doing this artwork which they sell. It's one way of understanding the difference between adolescent boys and adolescent girls. Now that law, it talks about human needs. We're interacting with an environment in order to get our needs met. And they fall into two categories. The first one is physical needs. We need to eat. We need to drink. We need somewhere safe to live. We need to be able to get a good night's sleep. They are physical needs. And there's also emotional needs. And while these have generally not been very well understood, a lot of problems arise when these needs are not met. What sort of emotional needs? Well, there's lots of them. But probably important for us to look at them in three categories. The first one is a need for connection. Humans are designed to be connected with other human beings. That's just a given. And without that worthwhile connection, emotional problems develop because that need for connection is not being met. Another one is a sense of meaning, and this is really important. Life needs to mean something to us. We need to be able to interact and get a sense of meaning that, yes, what I do counts for something. Who I am matters. That comes from a sense of meaning, and it comes from purposeful activity that that person is doing as they interact with their environment to get their needs met. Another important need is a sense of control. A feeling that I'm not being overwhelmed, I'm not frustrated and confused and just completely lost as to which way's up. I have a sense of control. The decisions I make matter, and the choices that I make have some significance. So those three, this connectedness, sense of meaning, and a sense of control, are very important. I would say in a lot of your work, if you're face to face with a situation where there's really bad emotional distress, you could look at unmet needs. Is this person's sense of control over their life, is that need being met? And if it's not, you're able to at least think of courses of action that might improve the chances of that person getting their sense of control met. It might just be in a small thing, but it's still important to have that need being met. You probably don't need a fire up where you are, but I'm interacting in a different environment, and it's quite cold down here. Now, we're talking about needs being met, and it's important to consider that it is possible to get a need met, but not in a healthy way. For example, a man might feel that he doesn't have much control over his life, and he comes home and he beats up his partner. He feels, at least in that area, I can be in control, I can be in charge, and what I say matters. Well, he's getting his need for control met, but look at the damage it's causing, both to him, because there are a lot of other emotional needs that he won't be able to get met. Intimacy, for one. Another example might be getting my need for food met. I'm hungry and I have a big bowl of chips and a can of Coke. Getting my needs met, but not in a way that overall helps me. There's no brain food in that. If that person doesn't seem to be able to make good decisions and act on them, a big part of that will be a lack of nutrients in the brain. A brain, like every other living organism, needs to get a variety of needs met to function well. Another example I used to come across a lot in my private practice was people would say, well, they sleep a lot, especially depressed people, so they're getting their need for sleep met, but not in a way that's good for them. They still wake up tired, so while their need for sleep is being met at one level, it's not being met appropriately because that sleep might go on for a good long time, but it's not quality sleep. What the restorative process of sleep is meant to do is just not happening. So yes, it's possible to get needs met, but in a way that prevents other important needs from being met.